I'll describe climate change risks as falling into three general categories, that is sea level rise, precipitation, and temperature increase. Sea levels have risen by as much as 7 inches along the California coast over the last century. And this increases erosion as well as pressure on the state's infrastructure, water supplies, and natural resources. Scientific findings produce estimates of as low as 12 and up to 55 inches by the end of the century, depending on emission scenarios. By 2050, temperatures are projected to increase by an additional 1.8 to 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit. It's already increased around 2 since 1960. And by 2100, the models predict temperature increases between 3.6 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit if emissions remain the same. Precipitation models suggest a small to significant, in numbers that would be around 12 to 35% overall decrease in precipitation levels by mid-century. In addition, the higher temperatures increase evaporation, which makes for a generally drier climate. As higher temperatures also accelerate snowmelt and increase evaporation. Research concludes that more precipitation will fall as rain rather than snow in the mountain areas, with serious implications for the state's water management. So what I wish to convey is how these changes could seriously affect those systems on which the state's economic, social, and natural systems depend. For example, going back to the temperature increase, this could cause the loss of up to 80% of the Sierra snowpack by the end of the century, which attenuates precipitation for water use during drier seasons. We have a water distribution infrastructure in place that depends on this snowpack to supply much of the state's $37 billion agriculture industry, as well as 2/3 of its population. Also, according to a Next 10 report in coordination with UC Berkeley, 2.5 of the $4 trillion of the state's real estate assets is at risk from sea level rise, extreme weather, and wildfires. So we wish to keep in mind that climate impacts are already occurring and are projected to be worse even if we were somehow able to eliminate emissions today. So in response, Governor Schwarzenegger issued an executive order last November that provided direction in developing California's first statewide climate adaptation effort. Going on to my next topic, the Adaptation Strategy. The Resources Agency, through the Climate Action Team, was named to lead the effort to coordinate with state agencies, as well as local, regional, federal, public, and private entities through a stakeholder process to develop a statewide climate adaptation strategy. This strategy summarizes the best-known science on climate change impacts to California and assesses California's vulnerability to the identified impacts, and then outlines strategies that can be implemented within and across state agencies to promote resiliency in the face of these climate impacts. These strategies are organized into near and long-term, with the participating agencies already committed to completing the near-term strategies. Long-term strategies may change as future research becomes available. And as Chair Nichols and Andrew mentioned earlier, it's very important to see adaptation and mitigation efforts as co-equal and integrated. The strategy was released by the governor last Wednesday, along with a couple of other adaptation products and milestones, one of which was the governor's naming a Climate Adaptation Advisory Panel to an independent panel appointed to assess the greatest risk to California from climate change and to recommend strategies to reduce those risks, building on the work that was already put together for the adaptation strategy. Also released was an adaptation tool on a Google Earth platform. Right now it's a prototype. Next year it will be fortified to provide geospecific climate impact information. That means type in your address, you'll see what potential impacts could occur in your area. I'd like to outline some key recommendations. This is featured in the executive summary of the report, which should be in your information packets. The first is to establish the advisory panel. This has been done, along with the strategy's release. Second, the second key recommendation is to adapt water management and use for climate change. This was directed under Senate Bill X71 to increase water use efficiency, expand storage, and improve ecosystem water delivery conditions in the Delta. Third, state agencies are called to avoid significant new development in high-risk areas from sea level rise, storms, and erosion along the coast, for example. Fourth recommendation is calling for state agencies to develop adaptation plans when they're doing their agency-specific planning for their resource areas if they are impacted by climate change. Putting together this strategy this process was already beginning to be done, is putting together this effort to coordinate adaptation efforts with other agencies. The fifth is to follow the California Environmental Quality Act. It already does have a protocol for addressing any impacts from projects, but recently the Natural Resources Agency added guidance language to consider the impacts of locating projects in areas susceptible to hazards from climate change. Sixth is to develop climate hazard mitigation plans, identifying the most vulnerable communities. We are working with the California Emergency Management Agency on that front. Also to identify the most vulnerable habitats. The Department of Fish and Game is leading that effort, and we'll have a report out next year. Eighth is to provide guidance to local communities in assessing ways to maintain and improve public health under climate change. The ninth is to offer guidance and tools for local adaptation planning. A good example of that is the adaptation tool that we just released. Also, the 10th is to identify wildfire areas most vulnerable, with CAL FIRE leading that effort. They too will produce a report on this next year. 11 is to increase renewable energy supply and efficiency under the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. And the final one is to make research and monitoring more accessible. This is synthesizing impacts down to useful information that communities can use. So the focus of the strategy is on science, the latest science, and finding out what statewide impacts we can draw from that latest science. Coming up with strategies and actions, near term and longer term, that we can take. That information is available through our website. I believe it's on the inside page of the executive summary, that handout that we have. My final topic is funding sources, additional funding sources for climate adaptation. Development of the strategy, our milestones so far, and the progress so far with the near-term activities have been completed with existing resources. As we continue our efforts, we're looking into additional funding sources. On that front, we're seeking federal grants for additional vulnerability studies. This is an important step at this time with our process, as we need to strengthen the connection between the identified statewide climate impacts, tying those to more specific vulnerabilities to make more clear decisions in the policies that we would need to address them. There are also two bills in Congress with language that allocate funds for climate adaptation. The funding would be secured through percentages of available emissions allowances yearly, then designating the revenue for adaptation programs. The first is H.R. 2454, last passed in the House of June of this year. It's the Waxman-Markey bill. For funds distributed to the states under this bill, 84.4% currently is said to go to state wildlife agencies, with the remaining 15.6% to state coastal agencies. The second bill is Senate Bill 1733, the Kerry Boxer bill. This bill establishes a fixed relationship between state and federal funding for adaptation programs, where 38.5% would go to state agencies and the remainder would be divided among federal agencies. In sum, under this federal legislation, support for adaptation under these bills begins small and would ramp up over time. And we have reason to believe that they would want from the states some proof that they have been doing some preliminary planning. Is another reason why we've been doing this work. This concludes my comments. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for the opportunity to offer this testimony, and look forward to answering any of your questions.